Immediately contesting the center, this pawn push aims to establish a foothold and potentially dictate early piece development. Immediately contesting the center establishes a fundamental pawn structure, shaping the forthcoming strategic battleground. Opening up diagonals for the queen and bishop while staking a claim in the center. Developing a knight to a central square immediately contests white's central pawn and prepares for further piece development. Challenging the center immediately, this pawn thrust aims to provoke a response and potentially gain space by opening up central files. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing for the Slav's robust structure demonstrates excellent positional understanding. Solidifying the center with a knight, this develops a piece and prepares for potential pawn breaks or pawn captures. Abandoning central pawn presence, black initiates a fight for queenside space, but risks falling behind in development. Probing black's queenside pawn structure, this advance creates immediate tension, forcing a decision about the vulnerable c4 pawn. Exposing the bishop early invites a queenside skirmish, potentially overextending if not carefully supported. Solidifying the center and preparing bishop development, this move subtly contests central space. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, black prepares to unleash the bishop and develop the kingside with tempo. Exchanging the bishop liberates the queen and prepares for rapid development, solidifying central control. Securing the bishop on this diagonal creates immediate pressure and forces white to consider their pawn structure's integrity. Castling locks down the king, securing it behind a pawn shield and bringing a rook into play for central influence. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies black's central control and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Securing the queen's diagonal connection now offers excellent counterplay potential. Repositioning the bishop to g6 improves its scope, eyeing the queenside and potentially preparing for a kingside attack. Centralizing the knight provokes a reaction, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Simplifying the center, black invites a pawn race after recapturing with the knight. Opening the e-file to target black's isolated pawn, while creating attacking chances for white's rooks. Reclaiming the knight after the capture creates a more robust pawn structure and prepares for active piece play on the queenside. Aggressively pushing the king's pawn forward, this creates imbalances and opens lines, a bold gambit for initiative. The knight embarks on a promising excursion, aiming to destabilize white's pawn structure and reclaim central influence. Reclaiming the open d-file immediately asserts central control and pressures black's isolated pawn. A bold gambit for initiative, the queen boldly ventures forward, aiming to disrupt white's developing harmony and creating immediate tactical possibilities. Clearing the path for the rook's central invasion, this bishop repositions to eye potential kingside weaknesses and foster a harmonious setup. Seeking refuge for the bishop, this retreat aims to unpin the knight and potentially reroute the queen towards the kingside. Shifting the queen to e1 strategically aims to reinforce the kingside defense and prepare for potential pawn advances or tactical skirmishes in the center. Exchanging the queens here simplifies the position, but surrenders the initiative and leaves the king slightly exposed. Liberating the rook to the central file signals a shift towards endgame play, aiming to exploit the open lines. Unlocking the knight's central potential offers dynamic counterplay after the rook exchange. Clearing the central pawn structure opens crucial diagonals, aiming to exploit black's slightly disconnected pieces. Opening the c-file for rook pressure, but surrendering central pawn majority now. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this offers a quiet but effective repositioning for future kingside pressure. Bringing the monarch to safety solidifies the position, a prudent step before embarking on further central maneuvering. Asserting the knight centrally, this move seeks to control key squares and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. Consolidating the bishop's position on the kingside, preparing to contest the d-file. A bold central pawn push, aiming to disrupt black's knight and seize initiative on the d-file. Accepting the exchange opens the d-file, but weakens your pawn structure significantly. Clears the d-file for your rook, creating powerful pressure on the queenside's isolated pawn. Reclaiming the open file is paramount. The rook now aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure. Controlling the open c-file becomes a priority now. Recapturing the pawn initiates a fight for the crucial central files, especially the d-file. Asserting control over the critical central file, a strategic priority established by the exchange on d6. Attempting to break white's central grip, but this pawn push opens a diagonal for the queen and weakens black's king position. Pushing forward aggressively, this pawn aims to conquer crucial queenside space and disrupt black's pawn structure. Embracing the open file, black aims to activate the rook and contest the central pressure. Prioritizing king safety, white seeks to activate pieces and potentially support a central pawn advance. Refocusing the bishop to the queenside establishes a potent outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially isolate the knight. Anchoring the bishop consolidates control of the queenside, preparing to exploit weaknesses after the pawn exchange. Reinforcing the queenside structure, this move aims to solidify the a6-f1 diagonal and prepare for potential pawn advances. Reinforcing the d-file occupation aims to squeeze black's position. Shifting the monarch to the kingside improves defensive coordination and prepares for potential pawn breaks. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to fracture black's defensive structure and create attacking potential. This pawn grab creates a positional weakness on the queenside, forcing black to defend it actively. Securing the d-file becomes paramount for white, preparing to contest the open road. Controlling the open c-file is paramount, and this retreat prepares to contest it with maximum force. This offers a strategic retreat for the rook, preparing to contest the crucial c-file and potentially activate the queen's side. Relinquishing central presence and piece mobility for a pawn structure that's difficult to support. Re-establishing pressure on the d-file, white seeks to exploit black's slightly awkward placement of the rook on c8. Repositioning the bishop to this active diagonal aims to improve piece coordination and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside. Reinforcing the rook's central presence, this maneuver aims to solidify the queenside's defensive structure while preparing for potential pawn advancements or exchanges. Shifting the bishop to b5 opens a diagonal for potential pressure and creates a more dynamic piece placement. Shifting the king to a more active post allows it to participate in potential pawn advances and provides a hidden shield. The bishop retreats, seeking a more dynamic position on the queenside to support the pawn advance. Initiating a pawn thrust to challenge black's central pawn structure and open lines. Opening the central files creates dynamic tactical possibilities amidst the positional struggle. A well-timed prophylactic measure, this bishop retreat fortifies the queenside pawn structure and prepares to contest the open c-file, potentially forcing a pawn break or positional concession. Securing the rook's activity on the 7th rank allows for future pressure and potential breakthroughs against white's overextended pawns. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now aims to disrupt black's queenside fortress and create attacking chances. Opening the kingside with this pawn push invites immediate tactical complications and potentially weakens your king's shelter. Pioneering a path for the rook into the opponent's territory offers a dynamic injection of energy. Reclaiming the e-file offers a crucial pathway for the rook to join the fight, a necessary step given the bishop's confinement. A strategic repositioning, the bishop now targets the c-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially seize control of the open c-file. Fleeing the encroaching white pawns, the king seeks refuge on the kingside, away from the open files. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to break open lines against the exposed black king. Shifting the king towards the center ignites potential counterplay and prepares to reinforce weakened pawn structures. This check forces black's king into a more exposed position, potentially setting up attacking opportunities. Slinging the bishop to d5 aims to disrupt white's central pawn and potentially force concessions, but it sacrifices precious defensive influence over the king. This tactical regrouping seeks to exploit black's somewhat loose pawn structure and activate the rook on the open file. Seeking to untangle the queenside, but black's rook now eyes the open c-file. Controlling the open file with this rook solidifies a crucial positional advantage. Asserting pressure on the d-file begins the pawn advance, aiming to disrupt white's centralized control and create counterplay. Consolidating the rook on the open file offers robust defense and prepares for future counterplay. Embracing the open diagonal for the bishop offers attacking prospects, though it leaves the kingside pawns somewhat vulnerable. Seizing the initiative with a timely sacrifice, this checks the king and opens critical lines for attack. Exchanges might seem simplifying, but capturing that pawn opens up critical lines for your rook and bishop to exploit white's exposed king. Advanced pawn thrust opens lines and forces a decisive confrontation. Recapturing the pawn with the rook opens a vital escape route for the king and challenges white's aggressive pawn push on the kingside. Securing the rook on the open file offers a crucial outpost and prepares for potential breakthroughs. A desperate attempt to create dynamic play by sacrificing material, but it opens lines to your king that white is well positioned to exploit. Sacrificing the rook on the king's path unravels black's defenses, forcing a king walk into inevitable checks. Activating the bishop here aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the queen side. Unlocking the file for potential penetration, this bishop maneuver threatens to shatter black's pawn structure. The pawns on the king side are now a significant weakness after this advance, inviting counterplay. A tactical geometry lesson, forcing the black king into a precarious position with exposed diagonals. Exposing the king to that diagonal now seems unnecessarily risky, given the open files. This king's bold excursion could lead to either a swift resolution or a dangerous overextension. Reclaiming the pawn opens lines for your rook and challenges white's control of the center. Capturing the bishop opens critical lines, creating immediate threats against black's exposed monarch. Sacrificing the rook to open up the king's position offers a desperate chance for counterplay. Bagging that isolated pawn now simplifies the material and opens up avenues for your remaining pieces to join the attack. Protecting the vulnerable king is paramount now, especially with the opponent's bishop poised to infiltrate. Unleashing the rook to join the attack, targeting weaknesses around the black monarch. Opening up lines for the rook is a risky maneuver when your king remains exposed to the attacking bishops. Exploiting the bishop battery on the c-file to pressure the weakened pawn. Repositioning the rook to a more active file offers counterplay against white's isolated pawns. Guarding the critical g-pawn now prevents pawn promotion and prepares a potential kingside attack. A desperate check, hoping to disrupt white's endgame control and escape the mating net forming around black's exposed king. The king's unexpected sortie aims to consolidate the central pawn majority and potentially create a passed pawn. A desperate check, desperately seeking any sliver of counterplay on the kingside before white's overwhelming material advantage decides the game. King's daring gambit, venturing into the enemy's chaotic formation, seeking to disrupt black's well-coordinated pieces. Securing the bishop's escape route from the pawn storm is crucial for any counterplay. Fortifying the advanced bishop secures a crucial outpost against black's counterplay. The king's safety is paramount. This retreats it from immediate danger. Unveiling the bishop aims to snag a pawn and sow disorder amongst black's defenders. The rook abandons the vital d-file, surrendering tactical initiative and inviting further infiltration. Sacrificing material to expose the black king is a bold gamble, hoping for a swift attack. Challenging the king with a check is the only recourse as the rooks are so menacingly placed. The monarch ventures out, seeking support amidst the remaining skirmish. The rook's repositioning now targets the queenside majority, aiming to disrupt white's defense and create pawn breakthroughs. Securing the rook's outpost on the 8th rank ensures it can support the king or join the attack. Gambiting the rook here desperately seeks counterplay against white's overwhelming material advantage, hoping to entangle the opponent's king. Pushing the h-pawn further threatens to restrict black's rook and gain space for your king. The rook's desperate retreat to the 4th rank offers a chance for counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's advancing pawn structure before it becomes an unstoppable force. Clearing the bishop's path to participate in the kingside attack. The bishop tucks away, seeking refuge from the knight's aggressive advance, but leaves the pawn structure vulnerable to further attack. Unleashing a royal discovery, forcing the black king into a precarious exposed position on the kingside. The king's retreat exposes it to potential threats from the active rook and bishop combination, a risky positional decision. Sacrificing the rook to force a queen exchange simplifies into a winning rook and pawn endgame. The rook's retreat to c5 offers a glimmer of hope, attempting to regroup and find support for its beleaguered king. This pawn's advance aggressively seizes control of the 7th rank, threatening to create an unstoppable passed pawn and seal black's king's doom. Relocating the rook to the 4th rank allows it to support a pawn advance while maintaining a crucial defensive post. Seizing the open file, the rook aims to dismantle black's pawn structure and provoke weaknesses. Unleashing a desperate counter, black sacrifices tempo to disrupt white's consolidating king. Focusing on the king's safety, this maneuver aims to escort the monarch to a more secure square, away from immediate threats. Bolstering the bishop on d5 secures its central post, preventing immediate pawn advances and preparing for a potential counterattack. Pushing this pawn now offers a potential escape route for the king, while simultaneously creating a dangerous passed pawn. Defensive repositioning of the bishop to safeguard the rook and prepare for potential queen or king opposition. Reinforcing the rook on the 7th rank offers crucial defense against black's active pieces. The bishop retreats, preserving its crucial defensive shield around the king while eyeing the pawn storm brewing on the kingside. Harnessing the bishop's diagonal, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king.